to give you a bit of, well, I won't say light relief, but an application in terms of what we're studying now with the aorist form, I like the example that Anthony Thistleton, who was an emeritus scholar from the University of Nottingham, New Testament scholar, has written some incredible books on hermeneutics. In the book by Paul Jackson's editor, Devotions of the Greek New Testament, he has a chapter on John 11:41, Jesus' prayer of thanksgiving. Pater Eucharisto soi hoti ekousos mou. And he particularly draws attention to the aorist form there of akouo, I hear. You can see from this, pater is a vocative of a third declension noun, father. It's a case of address. Eucharisto, it's an eo verb like phileo, first person, present tense, singular. We have the two personal pronouns there, dative, singular, soi. I give thanks to you, and then the latter part, mu, first person pronoun, genitive, of me, to him, and then hoti recitative here, or excuse me, hoti in respect to meaning, one of the meanings of because, and therefore we have a translation of Father, I give thanks to you because, and then we have the aorist form of akouo. You can see that the alpha is lengthened to an eta in terms of an augment put on the beginning. There's a sigma that's put on, which we've learned so far refers to the future. Now we're learning it as part of the aorist addition to the verbal stem, which in this case is the same as the present and the future stem. And then you get the endings, luso, lusas, so it's second person singular. So literally it would be, Father, I give thanks, or I am giving thanks to you because, and now, is because you heard me. And Anthony Thistleton brings out the notion that he says the answer appears, and he's talking about the notion of, this is the story of Lazarus who dies, and Jesus learns that he's dead from his sisters, Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, and then stays 2 days in the place where he's at. He's already told Martha that he will raise Lazarus. And then when he arrives 2 days later, then Mary says the same thing, if you'd been here, he would not have died. And Jesus says, basically, only believe. And then goes to heal him. And this is what Thistleton says. He says, the answer to the problem, which is his problem is what we've got here is not a raised body from the standpoint of the resurrection, because the resurrection not occurred yet. So when there's a raised body, according to 1 Corinthians 15, it will be a soma, a psuche body, a fleshly body raised spiritually, pneuma, from that standpoint. And therefore that's dependent upon the resurrection of Jesus, who is the first fruits. But in this particular case, what we're talking about is a body that's been decomposed for 4 days. And then Jesus is going to heal, he's going to raise him, presumably then for an earthly life of X number of years, and then he will die. So the idea that Thistle wants to bring out from the aorist form here is that Jesus' prayer was heard by God before he gets to be with Lazarus and his sisters and raising him, and therefore Jesus' prayer days earlier stymied the decomposition of the body. So he says then, how do we explain the reversal of the effects of decomposition? The body's been there 4 days and so on. The answer appears to lie in the use of the aorist in the clause ekousos mou, John 11:41. This could not have been a prophetic perfect of certainty. The aorist in this context carries a reference to past time and a past event. There it is. And he brings out some commentators who have actually established this. So that Jesus had already prayed to God several days earlier when he was told of Lazarus' death. God already had heard him. before the striking public miracle of verse 43. In other words, while Martha understandably assumed the decomposition had taken place, Jesus knew better. Hence, the restoration of Lazarus to ordinary life entailed no last-minute reversal of a natural process. Jesus restored to life a body for which he had already prayed to God for the cessation of decomposition. He bases that then upon the aorist active of akouo. The public miracle of the raising of Lazarus was the climax of a process which had began earlier. So you get that? Because you have heard me. In other words, you heard me when I prayed for the decomposition to cease, and Lazarus then would be raised. So it's a sort of a twofold act, so to speak, by Jesus. In other words, the prayer, the previous prayer would stop the decomposition, and then when he arrived with Lazarus, what he would do is he would raise him from the dead. I'm bringing that out to show then here's how Thistleton raises an argument based upon this aorist tense, and then he makes the application. And I think the application is interesting too, so I'll read it too. If Christian believers are to take Jesus as their example in prayer, almost everything else, prayer should not be a last resort in the face of crisis, unless this must be the case of necessity. We should be praying in advance for a future crisis, whether to modify it or to forestall it. Prayers require patience and foresight, as in John 11:41. Further, Jesus lived in constant prayer and communication with the Father. When he engaged in public prayer, he was not entering into prayer from a condition of not praying, but was giving overt expression to what was the basis and ground of his life. He'd already been heard by God, ekousas. Similarly, Paul urges us to pray constantly and so on. As a bonus to this, there should be no puzzlement about the double miracle of restoration to life and the reversal of decomposition. That's his argument then from ekousas. Martha had failed to realize that what she saw as a disastrous delay had already been dealt with by Jesus in his love for the Bethany family of Lazarus and in his previous communication with his ever-present Father. 2 points from that I would just apply is, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily make that argument simply on the basis of the aorist tense of that verb, but from the context. And then secondly, if I was applying that, I wouldn't make a reference to, oh, here's the Greek verb and so, and verse means this. You can bring it out without having to show that you know Greek. Without having to show that the audience knows that you know Greek. Sometimes we get carried away a bit. We want to just basically tell people how much we've learned and so forth and what they need to know. And occasionally, if you do it well, you might be able to do that. I might consider doing that in a class. For example, the word akouo, you could say to them in a class of, you could work out what akouo means, and then you could test them, and somebody might say, well, acoustic. Well, obviously it means to hear, and so on. So you could take it from there. But generally speaking, I don't make a reference to Greek words in a sermon, because it can come across as if you're trying to show off, and they don't know Greek, and they don't need to know Greek from that standpoint. But it's up to us to bring out the meaning, and that's where the Greek comes in, the grassroots, in terms of what the text is saying, and then we can apply it. And I think that Thistleton does this in an interesting way here, in terms of making 2 points on this aorist active verb akouo.